This is a special presentation of Viewpoint from Highlands Church. Hey, welcome everyone. Viewpoint is a podcast discussing challenging cultural issues from the Bible's point of view. We want to equip the church to be able to encounter the world around us with the truth of the gospel. Now, this episode is a special presentation because it features a live class session held on November 5th of 2023 on the topic of the war in Israel. On October 7th, the group Hamas from Gaza invaded portions of southern Israel in a brutal and horrific attack against several towns and settlements, and the resulting war has sparked debate and conflict across people and cultures worldwide. It's dominated the news cycle, and it's even caused division across nearly every Western nation. So how do we respond to these events as Christians? How do we even begin to enter into conversations with people around us? Most importantly, how can those conversations serve to point people we're talking to the hope we have in Jesus, the hope of the gospel? Is that even possible in a world so divided and in the face of this level of hate and brutality? And also, what does the Bible have to say about the events that happen in Israel? Are we witnessing Bible prophecy playing out in front of us on our news channels? So the class you're about to hear was hosted by our pastor of adult education and my usual co-host, Joe Infranco. He covered the history of Israel and the land that's in dispute. He covered the origins of Hamas and also the prophecy that we see in the Bible regarding Israel. So it's in lecture format, but Joe also took some questions from the gathered audience at the end. Also, just so you know, there are a couple of very small audio glitches in our class recording gear, so don't be thrown off if it sounds like a couple of times there are words skipped over here and there. The content is still very easy to follow. So without further delay, here's our Viewpoint class session on the war in Israel.
Hey, thank you all for being here today. And there's obviously a lot of interest in this subject. So let's open in prayer. Father, thank you again for this time, for your word, for your presence, Holy Spirit, to lead us, to guide us. Lord, at such a difficult and challenging time, even in the world, we pray that you'd be present, that you'd enlighten our hearts, that we'd know your mind. And Father, that we would be obedient in all that you say. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, welcome everybody. Is the world going crazy? So even as I'm leaving my house this morning, my wife is saying, "Are you following these demonstrations at the White House? They're putting red paint, blood-like hands on the wall, and there are cities rioting, and the temperature is ratcheting." And I checked maybe, a half dozen different world news sources. And what's happening in Israel is front page headlines everywhere. Well, maybe it would make more sense if I told you that all those things are actually prophesied. The Bible speaks about all of these things. So let me start by saying this. A lot of what I'm going to say today is just my opinion. And you may have a different opinion from me. If you do, that's great. If you'd like, I'm happy to sit and hear your opinion as well. And, we try to share, and I just call things kind of as best as I see them. But let me start with a few of those IMOs. First, Hamas, and we'll talk more about them. Hamas is a terrorist group. What they did in evil that kicked all of this off, what they did in Israel that kicked all of this off, is just plain evil. In my view, it is satanically inspired evil, the most horrific type you can find. These were murderous acts of terrorism. It's important, though, that we not generalize about people. Palestinians, for example, have a wide variety of views. Probably 15% of Palestinians are Christians. They are our brothers and our sisters in Christ. And let me say as well, once war starts, war inevitably brings casualties. And when you have casualties, that's a cause for sorrow, no matter who we are, no matter what's happening. There are estimates now that the losses on both sides, the deaths, probably of those deaths, 40% are under the age of 18. The death of a child is tragic, no matter whose child it is, where and when they live. And we want to have a sense about us of what's a biblical truth. We want to be careful to not fall into a spirit like James and John. There's a Samaritan village, and we actually just studied this last week. And Jesus and the disciples are traveling through. The village won't let them enter, and they say, "Oh, should we call down fire from heaven?" And Jesus rebukes them. And he said, "You don't know what spirit you're of." So we want to approach this now with some kind of sense of perspective, and let's launch into that. So there's a few parts to this discussion today. We'll leave time for questions. Part one, I'm just going to talk briefly about the history of Israel and the land of Israel. Now, the land of Israel was given to Abram, who would later become Abraham, in what's called the Abrahamic covenant. You see it in Genesis 15:18. It's repeated a number of places. God says to him, "I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you the land." And the land that he gives to Abram, or Abraham, actually goes from the Nile to the Euphrates. Israel has never occupied all of the land that God gave to Abraham's descendants. They've gotten to maybe about a little more than half, 2/3 almost, in the time of David and Solomon, in terms of what they controlled or had influence over. But today, the nation of Israel is really a tiny sliver. By way of comparison to what's around them, it's a little smaller than the state of New Jersey. So that's the amount of land we're talking about that's at the center of everything. Abraham is given the land. Israel doesn't actually enter the land until Yeshua, and that happens after the Exodus. They're in the land. They separate into two kingdoms. I'm just flying through this. The upper kingdom, Israel, is taken away and captured by the Assyrian Empire. Then the Babylonians come, and they destroy the southern kingdom, Judah, the city of Jerusalem, and Israel goes into captivity. They're in captivity for 70 years before they come back. If you looked in the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah calls Cyrus, the Persian leader, by name 200 years before he lived. And Jewish traditions say that when the Persians conquered the Babylonians, they went to Cyrus and they said, "Here you are in the holy writings." And Cyrus was apparently very impressed and gave the order for Israel to return to its land. We're really going to focus more on the modern period, but Israel is back in the land. They're there until in 70 AD, the Roman Empire comes and destroys the city of Jerusalem, literally fulfilling the prophecies of Jesus in Matthew 24, Luke 21, where he says, "Not one stone will be standing left on top of another." There are continued Jewish-Roman wars. They go through 130, 135, and finally Roman legions come in and they brutally get rid of Israel. And we have the start of the worldwide dispersion, what the Jews call the diaspora. And incidentally, if you wonder where the word Palestine comes from, it comes from the Roman leaders who, after they annihilated the Jewish people and they were removed from the land, the Romans, to insult the Jews, renamed the land Philistina, after their most hated enemy, the Philistines, who occupied Gaza, the area of the Gaza Strip, where all the excitement is taking place today. And from Philistina, eventually the word Palestine came as a kind of a generic description of the region. The land of Israel was next ruled by the Byzantine Empire for about 300 years. There's a kind of a series of empires. Let me say, the land itself was not this kind of great land that you would necessarily want. It's desert, it was swampy. Scottsdale, if you like rocks, it was a great place to be. When Mark Twain visited it, he wrote about it in his book, Tramps Abroad, and he described it as this God-forsaken place. It was miserable, and nothing lives there, and even the cactus have trouble living, So it went from the Byzantine control to a Muslim period of about 450 years. The Crusaders came in. They controlled the land for about 100 years. Then you had various Muslim interests just kind of claiming title of the land, not really putting much importance in it, interestingly, leading up to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire kind of ushers us into modern times. So the modern period of Israel begins, let's say, about 1900. Now, World War I comes along, and the Ottoman Empire sides with Germany. And so they're an enemy of the Western Allies, England and France. How many of you have seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia? A lot of you. Okay, that's that time when the British, T. Lawrence, is getting the Arabs to fight against the Turks of the Ottoman Empire. And so after World War I, Turkey really ceases to be kind of a dominant power and empire. That's as World War I is coming to a close, we come to 1917. There is so much history tied into what has happened in this land. If you sat down and you read a history book and how it's influenced leaders, you would say, it's almost unbelievable. How do we not know these things? 1917, British General Allenby is coming up to the city. He's looking down on it. Allenby is a devout Christian. His mother told him stories about the Holy Land from the time he was a child. And it's breaking his heart that he's going to have to go into Jerusalem and maybe destroy it to get the Ottoman Turks to surrender. And so he prayed. And as he prayed, he remembered a verse that he had learned as a child from Isaiah 31:5, where the Lord says, like birds hovering, the Lord of hosts will protect Jerusalem. He will protect and deliver it. He will save it, and he will rescue it. And Allenby thought, like birds. He had a plan. He sent planes over the city, and they dropped leaflets saying, you're about to be destroyed unless you surrender. And the people in charge of the city immediately surrendered unconditionally. The British marched in, took the city without a shot being fired. 1917 then starts the British Mandate, which lasts 30 years and takes us to the time of a UN vote. 1947, the UN is considering whether they should create a separate homeland for the Jewish people. What happened to the Jewish people during the Holocaust is very much on the minds of the nations of the world, and they vote with more than 2/3 of the vote going for Israel to create an independent homeland. But Israel still has to step up into it and claim it and actually become a nation. And they did that on May 14th, 1948. Now, it's interesting. When they became a nation, there were perhaps 500,000 Jews living in what's modern-day Israel. There were 50 million Arab neighbors. And those Arab nations around them said, if you declare yourself a nation, we will destroy you. Their saying was, we're going to drive you into the sea. I remember I was in India visiting a Rotary scholarship, and there was a girl who said, oh, you want to see my stamp collection? Oh, sure. And she showed me her Egyptian stamps. There was a series, an outline of the nation of Israel, a jagged dagger stuck into it and blood spurting out. Right? There were intense feelings among the Arab nations, and they outnumbered Israel 10. England and the United States were urging Israel, look, don't declare yourself a nation. If you do, you can't resist this. There's 50 million Arabs, and they've pledged to destroy you. And the early Zionist leaders got together, and the records of it will send chills up your spine. They said, we had a sense it was the time of God for our nation and our destiny. And when they wrote the Statement of Independence, I have a copy of it here, they made God prominent in it. And they dedicated their effort to the God of Israel, who they said they believed was inspiring them in this effort. Right after they declared themselves a nation, President Truman was advised by most of his cabinet, don't recognize Israel. There's about to be a massive war. They will probably be wiped out. You're going to make enemies among the Arabs. Just be neutral and stay out of it. But one of his advisors said to him, Mr. President, I think you should recognize Israel because God gave them the land, and showed him verses from the Old Testament. And Truman came to believe that God had put him in this position for this moment to recognize Israel. Years later, he was with Jewish groups, and they were thanking him for his courage and what he did. And to one Jewish group, and there's a lot of witnesses to this, he said to them, I am Cyrus. He wasn't saying that to brag. He was identifying with the historical Persian king, Cyrus, who was in a position that God put him in to allow Israel to go back to its land. What he was saying was, I was just responding to the position that God has given me because there's something else happening here. There's lots of these kinds of stories around. But for a little bit of perspective now, again, the size of Israel is smaller than the state of New Jersey. They have about 14.5 million people. That's a fraction of 1% of the world's population, roughly 1/5 of 1%. That's at the center of all this. Muslim nations have about 22-23% of the world's population. And their lands are so much larger, it kind of dwarfs, the comparison. So let's go into this now. Hamas is at the center of this. Who is Hamas? Okay, Hamas, first of all, is an acronym. It is an acronym that stands for Islamic Resistance Movement. But in Arabic, the word Hamas means zeal. Sorry, I couldn't get it for a moment. It means zeal, like we're zealous for Allah. A Hebrew scholar friend of mine told me, by eerie coincidence, Hamas in Hebrew means violence. And not just violence, but kind of the evil activity that you associate with the worst kinds of violence. It's almost never used in a positive sense in the Old Testament. If you were to look at Genesis 6:11 before the flood, and there's room for notes, by the way, in your papers, if any of you are interested. Genesis 6:11, it says, God looked at the world, and it was corrupt, and he saw that it was filled with Hamas, violence. And then God judges the world. Or in another verse that's notable, Ezekiel chapter 28 is one of these places where the prophet is talking about a king, in this case the king of Tyre. And the king of Tyre becomes a type of the Satan, the adversary in Hebrew, and suddenly becomes Satan himself. There's a kind of a transposition. And in Ezekiel 28, at that verse, the prophet says, you were filled with so I cast you as a profane thing away from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Jesus said in John 10:10 that the devil comes to kill, to steal, to destroy. And it's a spiritual influence that's associated with violence, division, destruction. We as Christians are motivated by an opposite spirit. We're told to love God, to love our neighbor as ourselves, to esteem others higher than ourselves, to serve others. If you want to be great in the kingdom of God, learn to be a servant of all. It's an opposite spirit that was the spirit that Satan in his rebellion himself showed, motivated by pride and violence and all of these things. But it's interesting that Jesus likens the scenario of his coming to the days of Noah. And in Genesis, it says that these were times of violence. Jesus, in capturing that, says, look, the way it was in Noah, the times of Noah, they were eating, they were drinking, they were marrying, they were giving in marriage. Things were going on. He's saying they weren't expecting the return. But I think by tying it to the times of Noah, he's also saying it's a time that's going to be characterized by violence. And you see that in some of the other teachings. In Matthew 24, Jesus says, if those days, referring to his return, were not cut short, and uses a graphic Greek word, kolobu means like amputated. If they were not stopped abruptly, no flesh would have been left on the earth. Basically, everything would have died. So let's go to the prophetic picture. I put some verses in your notes. I'm not going to stop and camp on them. There were 3 verses from Isaiah, just because these are illustrative. Read them at home. Basically, in these, God says to the other nations and says to his people in idolatry, look, I tell you things before they happen. You know the history. He had told Abraham, 400, your descendants are going to be 400 years in captivity. He had told Jeremiah, your people will be captives in Babylon for 70 years. Daniel read Jeremiah's scroll and said, 70 years, the time's almost up. Time to pray because, God is doing this. So God is outside of time. This is no trick for him. He sees all moments of time. And here God is saying, to these idols, prove yourself. Say what happens before it happens if you can do that. Look at what I do. Look at, I've said Cyrus 200 years in advance. Do that if you can. And of course, they cannot do that. And our Christian faith is largely founded on prophecies and prophecy fulfilled. Some people hear the word prophecy and they think it means telling the future. It's not really that. The Greek propheseo, the Hebrew, it's more you're speaking for God. And when prophets were speaking, they were confronting the people over how they were living and their sins. They were warning them what's going to happen. Here's what's coming. Read Deuteronomy 28 again. Read Leviticus 26. You're disobeying God. You're going to have famines. You're going to have invasions. Animals are going to come. And if you persist, you're going to be taken into captivity. And the prophets were always warning about that. But interestingly, as you go through all the prophets, they're always talking about God not making an end of the nation of Israel and the people and the time that he is going to restore them. Our faith as Christians really is grounded largely in prophecies. Anybody know how many prophecies in the Old Testament refer to the Messiah? They would say Mashiach. How many? Anybody want to guess? 600. Scholars generally think that there's about 300. Some will go higher. There's maybe of his death, the manner of his entry into Jerusalem, the type of suffering, the details of the crucifixion, the resurrection, on and on and on. But the Spirit of God fills the Old Testament with prophecies letting us know what's going to happen. What has God said about Israel? Now remember, the prophecies going back to Abram, later becoming Abraham, said, I'm giving you the land. He also said, I will bless those who bless thee, and I will curse those who curse thee. But there was another part of the Abrahamic covenant that in you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. How did God do that? Through Jesus. That was referring to a plan of salvation. But again, he repeatedly warned of the consequences. Now, let me just say, there's a school of theology that, it's not particularly large, that tends to look at Israel, sort of national Israel, and tends to say, well, God's written off Israel. Some of them will even go further and say he's divorced Israel. Everything that happens in the church. I don't see how you get there. There's too many prophecies. We're going to see a few of them as well. If you read Romans 9 through 11, especially chapter 11, it just reads very clear to me. I'm not doing it in Israel. So are there specific prophecies about Israel? I'm going to give you a few. I see people here from our chronological Bible study. Remember, we went through a long list of these. I'm just going to show you a few to get a sense how God does this. Zechariah 12:3. God says in this prophecy that in that day I am going to make Jerusalem, and Jerusalem represented Israel. I'm going to make it a burdensome, a very heavy stone for all the nations of the world. Now, how could that? There's a lot of cities with problems. I was looking up a few. A lot's happening in Hong Kong and Johannesburg and a lot of things. When I checked all these international news sources, nobody's reporting on any of them. We could add about a half dozen American cities, right, that are kind of a mess right now. Everything that happens in Israel arrests the attention of the world. It is front page news everywhere, exactly as Zechariah said it would be. Because Israel represents something profound. Even the name Israel was the name given to Jacob, Yaakov, when God changed his character and his destiny. And the name Israel means something like a prince with God, somebody who has wrestled and struggled and prevailed with God. So I think there's very much these things are happening there. Another prophecy is from Isaiah 66, verses 7 and 8, where the prophet Isaiah sees this and says, I don't know how this can happen, but the nation is going to be reborn in a day. And in the context, Isaiah is saying they're going to return to Israel from all around the world, but they'll be born, the nation will be born in a day like a mother giving birth. Now, that meant nothing to people then. Nations weren't created politically. They were created by wars and alliances and this and that. And it confuses Isaiah a little bit where he says, can that happen? That's what God says is going to happen. Literally fulfilled May 14, 1948. Or you'll find prophecies that call the nations by name where Jews returned back to Israel after 1948. There was a prophecy referring to Jews returning from the south. And the Hebrew was intensive. It was something like, don't hold them back. And I remember looking at them thinking, where's there a Jewish population to the south of Israel? The only one I could think of was there were these Philistin Jews in Ethiopia who traced their heritage back to King Solomon. They think the Queen of Sheba, had a child with Solomon. This is their thinking. I'm not commenting on it. And anyway, there's this Jewish population. But they would not be released. They were treated cruelly and miserably. And I remember mentioning in a class I was teaching, it wouldn't surprise me to see, the Jews there, the Philistin Jews, abruptly released and returning to Israel. Well, a couple of years later in Operation Moses, Israel came and snuck 8,000 of them out like in one weekend. I think now virtually every Jew has left Ethiopia. I remember seeing somebody years later and they said, I remember you said that. Ethiopia, did you have some kind of intelligence briefing or something? I said, well, matter of fact, I did. So there's also a prophecy, and this is, again, this is amazing to see in context, where Jeremiah says there's going to be a great exodus and return from the north. Now, he goes on to say it will be so great an exodus that it will eclipse the original exodus from Egypt. Now, that's astonishing. There are probably more than 1 million people in Egypt. But Jeremiah says, you're not even going to refer to the exodus from Egypt. I mean, you're going to refer to the exodus from the far north. Well, one of the largest Jewish populations was in Russia. The Russians would not let them go. Relationships and it almost stopped. And then the Soviet Union collapses and falls apart. And suddenly every year, hundreds of thousands of Jews are now leaving and making what's called aliyah, the right of return. Any Jewish citizen has a right of return to Israel. And I have the figures here from Israel. The most recent figures I saw had an excess of 1.4. They don't count everybody who comes for various reasons. There's probably like 1.5, 1.6 million people of Jewish ancestry have left from the far north and returned to Israel and are part of that population. Just one more to give you an example. There's a couple prophecies that say Israel is going to bloom. It's going to blossom. It's going to be filled with fruit. It's going to become like the Garden of Eden. Jerusalem looked more like the Sonoran Desert. How many of you have been to Israel? Yeah, a lot of you. And have you've seen maybe some of the places they're growing, the drip irrigation, the techniques that they've created, and the desert is blossoming. It says they're going to fill the world with fruit. literally fulfilled. You know, Israel is the largest exporter of fruit to Europe. So these are prophecies, again, actually fulfilled, some of them, you know, in our lifetime. So we see that these prophecies happen. Now that leads us to the next point then, a prophecy of a coming battle. And that is, and I want to focus a bit on this because people are wondering, what's happening there now? Is this going to lead us into a war? Could this be the fulfillment of some prophecies in the book of Ezekiel? How is all of this working? So I want to try to give you my perspective on that. We're going to focus mostly on 4 chapters, chapters 36 and 37, and then chapters 38 and 39. In chapters 36 and 37, and if you have your Bible and you want to follow along, of course, do so. God talks about how he is going to bring his people back to the land. He talks about the nations that are currently possessing it, how that won't happen, how Israel is going to come back. They're going to fill the world with fruit and all of these things. And God says something in verse 22 that's important. He says to Israel, I'm doing this for my name's sake, which you profaned among the nations. Like, don't think I'm doing this because you're so great. This is for my name and my promise and the certainty of my word. And then I love this down in verse 26 through 28. He talks about something he's going to do for the people. He says, I'm going to put a new spirit in you. I'm going to take away your old heart of stone, give you a heart of flesh. Similar to what he says in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 33. What he's talking about is, when you're back in there and you get to know who I am, I'm going to change your hearts. You're going to have an understanding of me that you didn't have before in all the years you were in idolatry. Chapter 37 takes us to a vision. The prophet sees this great valley and it's filled with these white, dry, bleached bones. And God says to the prophet, Son of man, can these bones live? Ezekiel, no fool he, says, Lord, you know. And as he watches, there's a great shaking in the land. The bones come together, they form skeletons. And then there is muscle and sinew and skin, and they're laying their bodies. And then suddenly there's a wind. In Hebrew, ruach would be wind, but also spirit. The Spirit of God comes upon them, and they come to life. And God says to the prophet, that's my people Israel. They've been scattered around the world. They thought they were dead. I'm going to call them back from all the nations where I scattered them, and I'm going to bring them back to life. And then he goes on to say in chapter 37, when that happened, briefly under David and Solomon, and they're going to have one ruler. And God gives these details about what is going to happen. That slides us in now to chapters 38 and 39, which talk about a great battle. And this, to me, is a clear prophecy, and it's not been fulfilled. And there are nations identified as invading Israel from all around. They're called by name. And the interesting thing that's common to these nations is they are almost all Muslim, and they all have a form of Sharia law. And Sharia law includes the idea of jihad, which is a hard word to translate. It's something like resistance, struggle, fight, but it also includes the idea of battle, of actual physical battle. And God gives the time of it in Ezekiel 30 and 38 at verse 8. He says, this is going to happen in the latter years. The Acharit Shoneh Hebrew would be, Acharit means kind of not just late, but last, end of the end. It'd be like the bottom of the ninth inning, 2 outs and 2 strikes. That's the sense of Acharit. So it puts this out kind of way out. And these nations that are primarily Islamic, bear in mind, this is written 1,000 years before Muhammad is born. So, you have this remarkable, thing over here. And so let's just can we pull up the map now, Kat? So I'm going to show you this map. I think that this comes in handy. The first nation listed is Gog from Magog. There are ancient historians like Josephus, Herodotus, who identify Gog and the tribe of Magog as being the early Scythians. The Scythians actually went up into Russia. And so for centuries, Bible scholars have said, in some way, Russia is going to be involved in this invasion. The view is split. I don't have a dog in the fight. Some people think it's not so much Russia up here, but kind of the former Russian republics that were part of the USSR, which are primarily Islamic. So you have Gog of Magog. Some people put Tubal here. Some people put it more up here. But it seems to be the leader. And the way the battle is described is God says to Gog, Magog, I'm going to put a hook in your jaws. That's a very graphic image. It sounds like fishing, right? I love fishing. Well, when I have a hook in the jaw of a fish, that fish goes wherever I want it to go. It doesn't want to come to me. It's trying to go that way, and I'm bringing it into the boat. So it's as if to say, you're going to end up going someplace you don't want to go. If it is some kind of Russian influence, it's just interesting. Recently, Putin kind of broke ties with Netanyahu. I didn't realize they spoke regularly on the phone, and Russia now is backing off and expressing some kinds of hostilities. The nations go on. The nation is kind of listed as the leader of things, and the nations that follow is Persia. Persia is modern-day Iran. And you'll find these nations, by the way, in maps hundreds of years old. And just so this makes a little more sense, if you see like Meshach was an actual person who becomes the head of a tribe. So like Ishmael becomes the head of the Arab nations, and Jacob becomes the head of the Jewish people, like that. And they tended to go to different geographical areas, and this tracked where ancient historians said that they went. So you have modern-day Iran a part of this invasion. Now, very interesting, Iran has, they've been giving them the weapons. Something that Hamas and Iran have in common is they are Shiite Muslims. Islam is broken down generally into Sunni, which is the majority in the world, and Shiite. The Shiite break down into three more groups, but part of the Shiite Muslim beliefs, this is a small part of Islam, but part of them have a very interesting eschatology or a view of end times, like how the world ends. And they believe in a Muslim Messiah, who they call the Mahdi, or the 12th Imam. And they say he's hiding, and what's going to bring him back is widespread warfare and terror in the world, because he's the one who brings peace. So that's going to cause his return. Scary thing, because in their theology, warfare and widespread world warfare would be a good thing, because that's what brings back this Messiah that they are looking for. So that's kind of in the background of all of these things. The other nations that you see listed, and again, Iran adopted Sharia law back in 1979 after, the Shah fell and Ayatollah Khomeini came in. You see the nation of Kush. Kush has long been identified right here, the north part of Sudan. If you've followed what's happening in the world, northern Sudan is Muslim, but not just Muslim. They have attacked and butchered Christians in the south part of the country. And they are fanatically Muslim, and they adopted Sharia law in 1983. Next nation mentioned is Put, which we know as Libya. Libya merged its secular courts and Sharia courts in 1973 as well. Gomer is mentioned. Gomer, this map has it here, I don't care for that. Gomer seems to have been more this area like a Balkan state. There are a few Balkan states like Kosovo, Serbia that are primarily Muslim, but Gomer would seem to be more this area in here, and then that's followed by Togarmah. Togarmah is generally viewed as Turkey. And it says Turkey, the prophecy says, Togarmah of the far north. So that would be the part of the tribe that maybe went up in here, like that. But it also identifies Turkey. Also interesting, because Turkey's had kind of a good relationship with Israel. You just wonder, are things setting up? Erdogan recently broke relations with Israel and basically said, if this fight continues, what you're doing right now in Gaza, we could respond to it. And this is generally where these nations are that are involved in the attack. Did most of you follow that airport attack when they thought an Israeli airline, right? And there were people running in the airport looking for Jewish citizens, right? I think they were going to kill them. That took place in a Republic of Dagestan. Dagestan, it would be kind of right here. So it's sort of right in that area. You see the intensity of the anti-Israeli feelings. And those are the nations that take part in the battle. It's interesting, there are three nations that seem to object to it, or three interests who object to it. And you can study this privately later. You see Sheba and Dedan. Sheba and Dedan are on the Saudi peninsula. And again, this has been thought for years. And then it also says Tarshish and its merchants and young lions. Tarshish would be basically Spain, somewhere over here. Remember from Jonah, he was going to flee to Tarshish. Tarshish was considered the progenitor of kind of modern day Europe. So it's interesting, you have European interests, the merchants, that sounds like the financial interests, and the young. So if you're talking about colonies that came out of Europe, well, you've got the US, Canada, Australia, then you get to other nations, very widespread. It's interesting because the prophecy also says fire is sent on those living in the coastlands who think nothing's going to happen to them. It's a very interesting, prophecy here. And what is it that's uniting this? Again, you have to wonder, is there something about the particular Shiite belief driving a lot of this says that Israel cannot exist as a nation. That's actually in the charter of Hamas. They exist to destroy Israel. And whatever they do in the process of that is acceptable. And part of the reason for that is that particular branch of Islam believes that once a land has been claimed for Islam, it becomes what they call Dar es Salam, the house of peace. Once that happens, it can never be given back. If Islam loses control, then it must be taken back violently if necessary. Now, it might be that 1 in 1,000, Muslims believe that. But you don't need that many sometimes to drive policy, and a tail wags the dog. We don't want to generalize. I mentioned Iran. I don't know what your feelings are about Iran. I have a friend who goes there and spends time there and works with churches. Do you know Iran has one of the fastest growing churches in the world? I know, Mark, and you all know that. And 70% of the citizens of Iran are under the age of 30. They are largely rejecting the Ayatollahs and Islam. They're becoming secular. Some of them are becoming radicalized, but it's an interesting transformation. It's illegal to import music there, but do you know who the 3 most popular acts are that are all over? They are Megadeth, Metallica, and Britney Spears. So young Iranians are into heavy metal and exploring Christianity and secularism. So again, we don't want to generalize about people. God is doing work in Muslim nations. There's an underground church growing in Saudi Arabia, one of the most dangerous places in the world in which to be a Christian. And we never want to discount what God is doing. So this attack takes place. And Ezekiel 38 and 39 describes the outcome of this war. First, it says the people from these nations come and they mobilize and they come from the north. So far, we've only seen conflict from the south. I think things could be setting up for something like this prophecy. Hezbollah has similar interests to Hamas. They are amassing troops in Syria and Lebanon. They claim to have 100,000 troops. It's generally not thought to be the case. They might have 10 to 20,000 troops. But they're talking about amassing more soldiers and calling soldiers in Islam to come there if they need to be part of an invasion and open a second front against Israel. Israel has said if the Arab world opens a second front against us, don't look for us to hold back. There have been 7 wars, all started by Arab nations, including surprise attacks like on Yom Kippur in 1973. And Israel won every single one of them. And they're known to have nuclear weapons. And they are fighting an existential battle. They believe this is literally for their lives. Ezekiel 39 describes the outcome of the invasion. God says, you come against the land, there's so many troops, you cover it like a cloud. And God himself, he says, my fury, my anger rises up in my face, in my nostrils. And I rain down fire and brimstone. And this invading world would look at this and say, how do we even make sense of this? Israel waits 7 months before they even go out to look for bodies. When they go out to look for bodies, they send out specialists who give markers on the location of the bodies, maybe because they have to be disposed of a certain way. They take weapons that were going to be part of it and somehow use them for fuel for 7 years. Does this sound like, I don't know, post-nuclear war? You wait 7 months to, who knows what it is. But this is what happens. In the end of chapter 39, God says, in that day, I will pour out my spirit upon the nation of Israel. That before this happened, they really didn't know it was God. And now there's no possible explanation for what's just occurred. And Israel has this understanding now of the God of Israel and what he has done in this war. There are some Christians who think that perhaps even that could correspond to the, a rapture of the church or something like that. There's really no way to know. But so far, I would say it's not the war of Ezekiel 38, 39. I've been watching these prophecies for over 45 years. I've never in my life seen a building in the world. It's on college campuses. There's riots in nations around the world. There's this pressure. It just is increasing everywhere. There's this resurgence of anti-Semitism, which I personally believe is satanically inspired. You'll find it in the Bible. Go back to Haman and go back to other times in the Bible. Why did Stalin want to get rid of all the Jews? Why did Hitler want to get rid of all the Jews? It's a satanically inspired belief against God. It's the only way that I can make sense of it. And I think there's a resurgence of this in the world, and that's going to produce this kind of violence where things just seem to get out of hand. Okay, so what's some conclusions, and then we'll do questions. What some of the things we can draw from this? Okay, it doesn't seem to be Ezekiel 38, 39 right now. It is, however, very interesting to see things aligning that we perhaps in our lifetimes may see this. But we need to get some perspective. Number one, the Hamas attack on Israel needs to be understood. Our population in the U.S. is about 330 million. If you take the population of Israel and you scale it up, it would be like there's an invasion where 50 to 60,000 people die. We responded as we did to 9/11. It was an act of war, right? And imagine if 50,000 people had been killed on 9/11. What would the feeling have been in the nation? That gives you some sense of what's happening. Second, I think we have to remember, Hamas is a terrorist organization. Their charter is dedicated to destroying Israel. As believers, we have to be clear, unequivocal. It is savagery. It is never acceptable anywhere, anyhow, anytime to be slaughtering people as they did. This is not about romanticizing a Palestinian cause. It's about identifying the philosophy of Hamas And I think Israel is right in opposing it. Third point, don't oversimplify it. It's not that everything Israel does is good, everything here is bad. Israel makes mistakes. When they do, they acknowledge it. Israel has done some things even historically that they've said these were wrong. We shouldn't have done these things. A difference is this. Israel is motivated by a kind of spirit that they don't target civilians. If they're attacking civilians, they try to warn civilians to get out. The philosophy of Hamas is go after the most helpless civilians, have the most horrific, terrifying acts to demoralize people, to incite violence, and get a response. And then if there's a response, scream, oh, look what you're doing, look what you're doing. There's no moral equivalence in my eyes to what Hamas did and what Israel is doing in response. That's not to say there shouldn't be limits on things. How those work, I don't know. It's a complicated picture. I will say this. The Bible tells us, Psalm 122:6, that we are to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. I would say by extension, that means really pray for Israel, but not just Israel. I think we should be praying for all the events of the Middle East, all the nations there, the work that God is doing in Muslim populations. God has a much bigger perspective than any of us see. We tend to have a narrow kind of view of things here. It could be that we will live in a time when there is widespread warfare, economies collapse, your 401k collapses, and all of these things, right? Look, we live in a little protected bubble in history. The history of the world has not been easy. If you were a Christian the first three, and in games, you might have been burned alive. And the history of the world since then has been filled with savagery, disease, warfare, every kind of thing that you can think of. We have this kind of false little sense of, oh, it should go on, and I'm more interested in the Cardinals game. Nothing against the Cardinals game. I'll probably watch it. Right. I'm just saying there's a kind of sense when things are happening in the world, it might be that God is provoking us to get out of our comfort zones and to be more about praying and really looking and asking, let your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Let it be done in hearts in Muslim nations, in Israel, everywhere, in this nation, in all the divisions. And the Spirit of God opposes these things. God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. He wants us to esteem others higher than ourselves. He wants us to serve. He wants us to be known for our good works. We're the ones who gather in those who are hurting. We're feeding the hungry. We're clothing the naked. What you've done for the least of these, you've done for me. The way God calls us to live is diametrically opposed to the spirit of this age. And it's not just the fact we're giving and we're doing good things. That's all good. I think there are times we need to, as a church, be praying and more seriously thinking about God has plans in this world for this time. And we want to know about that and be a part of it. And how else? Let's say we're here and these things happen and this world war looks like almost World War III. We're not the ones who be running around like chickens without heads, God is always in control. In Luke's Gospel, chapter 21, verse 28, Jesus, talking about the end of these things, says, when you begin to see these things come to pass, lift up your head, rejoice, your redemption is drawing near. If we see these things come to pass in our time, yes, we'll be glued to TV screens and all that. That's the time we want to be with people we know and say, let me tell you about this. This is what God said was going to happen. It's time for you to find out about Jesus. It's time for you to make yourself right with God. We want to be the people who show peace in those times and are not living in fear over the events of the world, but showing the world a different way to live. Lift up your heads and rejoice, because if all these prophecies are coming to pass, so are the best ones you could imagine. an eternity where there's no more death, where every tear is dried and there's no more sorrow. And we live in the presence of God and the joy and the peace that he's prepared for us. Boy, I'll put up with some birth pangs for that. I don't know about you. So time for some questions. I'll repeat the questions. Yeah. What question? Why is the Arab world not willing to take in? I can just give you my take on it. I think that the Palestinians are useful for people who are trying to push the conflict and destroy Israel. The amount of money that's been given to Palestine is staggering. When Arafat supposedly made off with billions and billions of dollars. If you took all the aid that's been given and you had no middleman and just gave the money, they'd be the richest people in the earth. I think that sadly they're being used as political pawns. And I think there's a purpose for certain interests to want to keep them in a kind of misery. That doesn't make their suffering any less real. But I think that there's political reasons behind it to keep the conflict alive, that look what you're doing to these people. That's my best understanding of it. We'll come back. Yeah. Damascus being destroyed. There's also prophecies about Gaza being destroyed, frankly. It's hard to know. When you look at a prophecy and you study prophecy, you have to look at the context. Very often it has a localized application. It's talking about a particular time or a particular king. It's hard to project it out to a future application unless you have some context in the prophecy that gives you license to do that. It's also difficult because sometimes prophecies have dual reach. You know, Jesus in Luke 4 reads from the scroll of Isaiah 61, and he reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, he's anointed me to preach, good tidings to the poor." He's talking about his first ministry, and he stops reading at one point. And if he had read one sentence more, he would have read, "To usher in the day of judgment of the Lord." That's something he's going to do, but it was not part of his first coming. So sometimes even in a prophecy, scholars will disagree. It's hard to see it because sometimes the prophet sees near and far at the same time. Messiah is going to do this. This is going to happen in Israel. It's not always clear which are close, which are intermediate, which are further out. So I try to be very careful with those prophecies. I'm not teaching those as if I know those to be the case. Yes. It says they'll cease from being a city. There's prophecies that say Babylon. Yeah, there's prophecies that say Babylon will be destroyed. Maybe. Yeah. Yeah, why are you seeing division among Jews? I work with a number of Orthodox Jewish groups over the years, even in some of their cases. One of the surprises to me was the animosity between kind of liberal Jewish groups and the Orthodox. And I would ask friends in that community, why is this? And they said, we don't know why there's such antagonism. We think it's because we live according to Torah and they are convicted by the fact we're doing this. But I would say it's not so much the fact that they're liberal Jews as it is, they're more under the sway of the spirit of the age, the values that they adopt, and maybe they got them when they went to college, maybe they got them in their social groups. There's very strong pressure to conform to all of these kinds of views that they have with their friends and in their community. And so I think that maybe that's more of the motivation. It's not because of their Judaism. I think it's in spite of their Judaism. But yeah, there's a very, very fierce divide, and it is hard to understand. It seems to me these things ultimately are spiritually derived. That's the only way I can really make sense of it. Questions? Yeah. Yeah, why has the UN failed to recognize Hamas as a terrorist group? I mean, great question. The UN is highly political. The way it works, you have groups. When I was at ADF, we became an NGO, and I had to go to the UN and testify in this rather large committee where they ask you what you believe. I could not get over the politics. I mean, I got told by people, make friends with the Turkish delegate and this guy and that guy, and this one influences that, and Egypt votes with this one and all that. And it was very complex and political. Thankfully, they supported us and they approved our application. But, there were things I didn't understand. Cuba voted against us. I have no idea to this day why. So it's just so highly politicized. There's layers and layers. I think you just have to write it off to the politics of it. I visited the delegate from Iran, and I went to his said to me, I'm not a voting member of the community and of the committee. And I said, I know that, but I'd heard very good things about you. I wanted to meet you. He said, really? And he was so moved. 20 minutes turned into about 2 hours. He brought in food and coffee and all that. And I asked him, what's on your heart? What do you want to do here? I want to eliminate child sexual trafficking and this and that with all my heart. And I said, it seems like everybody would want that. Why wouldn't the UN vote for that? He said to me, you have no idea how political it is. There's so much money involved and so many interests. I just tell them to their face who they are, why they're doing it. But that's the way it works there. It's a complicated picture. Yes. Is there a prophecy that points to it? Yeah, scholars believe in Zechariah 12. There's a prophecy where it says we'll look upon him. They're going to look on the Messiah they rejected, and they're going to mourn over it. And so there's indications like that. It's an interesting subject. I've spoken with Jewish groups, and they've said, well, why didn't we know he was Messiah if all these prophecies are there? And I said, well, there's prophecies that you would miss him and recognize him later. Really? So it's an extraordinary picture. Yeah, questions? Yeah, so the question is the intelligence failure in Israel. Hard to understand. As you say, the Mossad is most sophisticated intelligence in the world. The U.S. goes to them to get information. I don't think it was intentional. I think it may have just been a slip up from a divided government. They thought what they had in place was enough. I cannot imagine people in Israel intentionally hiding that for that kind of horrific, event. A thing about an attack like this is it tends to unite people. After Pearl Harbor, after 9/11, you never had a more united nation for that period of time. I think that's happening in Israel. And even though there's questions about the intelligence failure, I think it is firming up their determination. When Netanyahu says there will be no ceasefire till every hostage is returned, I think probably 95% of people in Israel feel exactly that way. It seems like they're heading down a course. There doesn't seem to be any easy way out of this. It may be it's going on its own momentum to keep increasing the volume and the anger and the division in the camps. And maybe that's the kind of thing that's going to take us to the point that these other prophecies will happen. But I think it was just an intelligence failure. Questions? Yeah. Okay, so good question. A lot of Arabs are peace-loving. I met plenty of Muslims over there who are peace-loving. They can't stand this stuff. Why aren't they speaking up? I think speaking up is complex. How many of us speak up when we see things that we should be talking about? I think when you speak up here, we don't want to be in cancel culture. We don't want to be attacked on social media. I think the cost for Arabs speaking up there might be a lot higher if you lived in us with weapons. So I think that there's a kind of a sense of fear, of helplessness. I think a lot of people would leave if they could. I think you have a small percentage of extremism or beliefs derived from extremism that people are just afraid of, and it's just not easy to speak. So that would be my best guess. Yeah. Okay, so how, these are difficult times. What should we be doing? How do we approach this? And I'm glad you asked that because I wanted to mention we have a partnership with Convoy of Hope. They do have a Middle East conflict response. If you feel moved, they're giving to both sides. Humanitarian aid is important. James says, you don't want to be the kind of Christian who says, I wish you well, hope you're warm and well fed, but you don't do anything about it. If God puts this on your heart, then give. I would say giving, prayer, and the most powerful thing I think we can do as believers is just speak the truth. There is something about truth in a time of craziness and deception that is very, very powerful. If people are screaming about this or that or a Palestinian cause, I think someone has to stand up and say, It is never acceptable to kill civilians, kill babies, rape women, do this butchery. If you're defending that, then you are defending pure evil. I think we have to not be intimidated and afraid to speak. If enough people speak truth, in my experience, truth gets a foothold, and then it enters the conversation. It's like that old parable, the emperor has no clothes, right? It needed one little boy to say, oh, the emperor has no clothes. And all of a sudden, everybody was willing to admit it. Truth is very, very powerful, and God is truth. I know we're over, and I didn't want to cut your questions short. Let me just say, there seems to be a lot of interest in this. If any of you have an interest, I barely skim the surface. If any of you have an interest in digging deeper on some of this stuff, email me at the church, and we'll get together some informal times where we can sit, you can ask questions, we can talk, we can dive deeper. If you have an interest in that, just let me know. Final question, and back to your question, take prayer seriously. When God tells us to be praying about these things, don't make that a matter of form. Really pray about it. Final question? Yes, Ken. The question is, how is it the world is not universally condemning this? Those kinds of mysteries, or why some of the groups are supporting them that are, like, why are LGBTQ groups supporting Islam? If they lived in most of those nations, they would be punished or put to death. If they went to Israel, they'd be welcomed. So what is it that there are things that don't make sense? The older I get, the more I feel that everything is spiritually derived. Every issue, if may present as economic or social or whatever, if you roll it back a few times, everything I think ultimately is a spiritual issue. These things are spiritually ascertained. There's resistance and hatred of God, be done. And those to whom God says, thy will be done. And if people want to persist in glorifying violence and all of these things, and they're in rebellion against God, God warns them. I pray for them. I think this is just the time and what the scripture tells us we're to expect in this age. So thank you all. Blessings to you.